Here we are, just a couple weeks into the ongoing U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran. And one of the narratives that we keep hearing come out of the Trump administration to explain this to the American people is that this is somehow about preventing nuclear weapons from being made by Iran in the first place. Right up front, I think there's a whole lot more technical information that everyone in America should understand, and we do a terrible job of teaching it. So this video is going to just use open source information to lay out some basics that I think everyone in the United States should understand to better assess for themselves, for yourself, whether or not these talking points add up. The first thing I want to do is just level set some of the situation. There were negotiations going on just before these military operations took place. But interestingly enough, from the American perspective, the people who were actually in the room doing the negotiations were Jared Kushner and one of Trump's golf buddies. Our government has true nuclear diplomacy experts. They were not there. That is one thing that I think should automatically set off a little bit of a red flag in understanding the talking points we're hearing. Another thing is we know that the former Ayatollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa, which is a religious order within Iran, to not build these weapons. And the third thing we know is what was published in a publicly accessible document by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Now I want to read just one sentence out of the national threat assessment that they produce. Quote, "We continue to assess Iran as not building a nuclear weapon, and that Khomeini has not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003, though pressure has probably built on him to do so." End quote. Keep in mind that the person that is being described here is someone that we killed in these joint bombing raids, in these bombing attacks. And his son, who took over as the next supreme leader, is far more hardline on these issues than his father ever was. That is all publicly known and already, I think, enough publicly available information to really question these talking points about where Iran was in the stages of potentially developing a nuclear weapon. The other part that isn't being talked about right now, that I think every one of you deserve to understand better, is the open source information of what it actually takes to build a nuclear weapon in the first place. And I'm just going to break it down into three components that any country absolutely needs, and then we'll get into the so what. Why does it all matter, right? The first thing you need if you want to build a nuclear weapon, if you're a country, or anyone to be frank, is what's called fissile material. That is material that is capable of having a nuclear reaction. A nuclear reaction is basically you slam a neutron into an atom, and there's a certain probability of that atom splitting. In uranium and plutonium, the two materials most commonly used. When that atom splits, it produces two other atoms, which is two other materials, a bunch of radiation, a whole bunch of energy, and other neutrons. That is fundamentally what a nuclear reaction is. You can use that nuclear reaction in medical research and use certain types of radiation to do things like treat cancer. You can use it in a civilian nuclear reactor to take that energy, use it to heat water, to turn a turbine and make electricity. Those are perfectly valid uses in the international community of why you would want to have nuclear power outside of having a weapon. And then in a weapon, you would take that same reaction, and instead of trying to control it to get a very specific output of either energy or a particular type of radiation, you would pack as many of those atoms as you can close together and have every one of those reactions produce three more reactions and have the amount of energy it would produce before the physical device quite literally blows apart. It would become exponential. And that's why nuclear weapons are so much more devastating than any conventional weapon we could possibly build. I will come back to these fissile materials and how they're made, again, using nothing but open source information here in a second, because I think there's some interesting things from previous agreements that paint a more clear story on where Iran actually was in this process. The second thing you need past the fissile material is you need a way to start the reaction. Typically, that is viewed in sort of two configurations, both of which that we use as America when we drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first type is what we call a gun type. And you take a slug and you use conventional chemical reactions or an explosive to throw that slug at some other material, combining at high pressure. That starts the actual nuclear reactions in the nuclear weapon. We were so convinced as a country that that system would fundamentally work that we never even tested it before we dropped it on Japan. It's relatively simple in design, but the yield isn't as much. Then you have a much more complicated design where you build a perfect sphere of fissile material. And then around that, you have conventional explosives, but arrayed in such a tight tolerance that when you set them off, the chemical reactions of those explosions send shockwaves towards the middle. All those shockwaves ideally would hit at the same time. Again, all to build up a huge amount of pressure to start this chain reaction and have a nuclear weapon go off and have it hold together and maximize the amount of reactions you can have. Those are the two ways you can build it. And there's a ton of ways you can simulate this on computers and whatnot. But fundamentally, you need to test it if you want to be sure it's actually going to work, especially if you want to get the most bang for your buck. There are other sort of dirty bomb things you can do, but most countries who have ever developed nuclear weapons have tested them before they would ever actually be used. And I know I said that we didn't test the gun design before we used it, but we were also in the middle of a world war. It was the one and only time in human history that a country didn't test a particular type of design. So that's an important part here, because one thing we don't hear any conversation about at a national level is where Iran is. If they're so close to developing a nuclear weapon, as Netanyahu would say, they're 2 weeks away. We have seen American officials say something similar. I would also just warn you, Netanyahu has been saying that they're 2 weeks away from a bomb since the 1980s. So are they 2 weeks away if we haven't heard anything about their actual testing of these different warhead types? I'll let you be the judge of that. The third thing you need is a way to deliver it. We have done just as much testing on missiles and how to actually package a nuclear warhead in a way that could be delivered by submarine, by air, by a land-based missile. Russia has done the same thing. Other countries have done a ton of it. And in fact, when we hear about the North Korean nuclear program in the news, we hear a lot about their missile testing. We hear more about that than their nuclear weapon testing, although we still hear about that. It is publicly out there in the news because it's not something you can hide. Iran has been certainly building regional-based missile technology, as we all seen in the retaliatory strikes. But what we haven't heard publicly yet, at least, is where Iran would be and how they would deliver this weapon in the first place. Now, our American brains may go to missile development, which takes years and years and years and years to develop to a level where you can be comfortable using it. We typically think that because if you're ever going to use a weapon like that, it's going to be typically a last-minute decision where you don't have a lot of time to react. But to be fair to people who are saying this is absolutely about nuclear weapons, you could put a nuclear warhead onto a ship and ship it over somewhere. You could sell it to an organization like Hezbollah that we know their Iranian regime has relationships with. There are other ways to do this, but all those ways that are slower are also far more susceptible to being interdicted by our intelligence services and other agencies that are out there constantly monitoring for this stuff. So it's a matter of risk. It's a matter of how comfortable would that regime be with an incredibly slow, outdated delivery mechanism. And even then, we actually haven't heard anything about this, of how Iran would actually do this if we think that they were literally 2 weeks away from having this capability. That's where across the three things, it doesn't really add up that Iran was a couple weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon that we would need to be afraid of in any way, shape, or form. Well, I shouldn't say that. They definitely were not 2 weeks away from having the full package, at least from what we know in the public so far. Going back to fissile material, like I said, there are two types of material that you need to understand that could make a nuclear reaction work. One is plutonium. The other is uranium. Let's talk about plutonium first. In order for plutonium to work, you need a particular isotope. That isotope can be, I don't want to say easily made, but it is well known that you can make it by taking uranium through a heavy water nuclear reactor. I'm not going to get into the specifics of why. One of the outputs of that particular type of reactor is weapons-grade plutonium. Iran had one of those reactors. When they signed the JCPOA, which was the agreement that the United States had with them going back to the Obama administration, that reactor was filled with concrete, unable to make any plutonium in the future. Likewise, the other reactors that you may be able to reconfigure to produce some of it were redesigned by European, American, Iranian scientists to not be able to do that. One of the highlights of the JCPOA that not enough people know about is that it basically shut down for a generation Iran's ability to make a plutonium-style weapon. That leaves uranium. The way that you make uranium into enough material to be a nuclear bomb is the same way that you would make it enriched enough to be used in a reactor. What do I mean by that? Uranium out of the ground has a couple different isotopes. The isotope we really want for a nuclear reaction is called U-235. Out of the ground, natural uranium ore has about 0.7% U-235. To be used in a nuclear reactor, you need about 3 to 5%. To be used in a weapon, you need above 90%. The way that you get from 0.7% to any other percentage you want is the same way. You take that ore, you chemically process it into a powder, which is called yellow cake. You take that power, make it into a gaseous sort of environment, and you spin it around. These are called centrifuges. In fact, in June 2025, when Trump said he obliterated the Iranian nuclear capability, what they bombed was really one of these facilities that had a bunch of centrifuges. And you whip this around, and these isotopes are slightly different in weight, and the whipping around will have the heavier isotope go to the outside and the lighter isotope stay on the inside. And that's how you basically separate the isotopes to get to the percentage you want. Now, the only difference of making natural uranium into 5% enriched or 90% or more enriched is the amount of time and energy it takes of whipping around to do the same process basically over and over and over again. That is what, if you have the capability of doing that to 3 or 5%, you have the technical capability of making weapons grade uranium. And that's where opponents or people who didn't like the JCPOA would say, well, if they can use this for their civil nuclear environment, they're of course going to use it for their bomb because you can't trust them. Well, that's why in these agreements, you don't trust them. You have entire verification regimes or entire verification systems that included under the JCPOA, things like 24/7 video monitoring, things like snap inspections, things like we would actually show up there randomly for these snap inspections and count everything and test the material itself. You would have reporting requirements. You would have opportunities to buy the excess fuel to be able to inspect it. There's a ton of ways to actually verify it. So you don't trust them, you verify it. And those protocols were very much a huge part of what the JCPOA was all about. But that was fundamentally ripped up during the first Trump administration. So for those who are saying Iran is just a couple weeks away from having a bomb, I would just point out, and a reason to be genuinely critical of that talking point is, were they a couple weeks away from being able to make enough fissile material for a bomb? Maybe. We had protocols in place that our current administration, or at least the president in his first term, ripped up. But that doesn't necessarily make a bomb. We haven't heard enough talk publicly about what we know about where they were in a warhead design. We don't know enough about their delivery mechanism they were designing. We haven't heard anything about this, but we've heard plenty about it from other countries that were sort of in a similar spot, we thought, like North Korea. And that discrepancy, along with the discrepancy of the ODNI report of the threat assessment, along with other things, makes me really question whether or not they were actually that close to making a bomb. And oh, by the way, here's the so what. First of all, if we're going to spend money and lives doing something like this, we should really know why we're doing it in the first place. The second part is the second and third order effects are real. Iran was in the middle of negotiations when we attacked. Even if they were in the middle of developing a nuclear weapon, the message that this sends out to the rest of the world is negotiating doesn't pay, and that we actually need to defend ourselves with nuclear weapons more. And we've already seen announcements from countries like China and France that they're going to increase their nuclear stockpile. France has been elevating their nuclear forces on higher alert than they have been in years. That, to me, is why I'm so worried that this administration's talking points seem to be all over the map. The narratives don't seem to add up. And I think we as Americans deserve better than what we're seeing. And if this was a real threat, then we deserve to see all of the relevant information that doesn't give away sources or methodology to make the case to the American people of why it was a threat and why now. We haven't seen that yet. And I think you and I all deserve better than this, particularly from this administration. Add a comment below if you think there's something else I need to dive into to better understand what's going on. And don't be afraid to question our leaders. That is what our system is all based on. And I think we can make a better system if we all were a part of it. Thank you. If you haven't yet, please click like on this video, drop a comment below, and click that subscribe button. It'll help the YouTube algorithm make sure that these videos are getting into your feed. Thank you.